Welcome, viewers, to the next edition of Development Talks. We are very fortunate to have Camelia Dewan, who is the Assistant Professor of Cultural Anthropology in the Uppsala University, Sweden. And she has recently published a book, Misreading the Bengal Delta. And today we would like to hear um, on this book. So, and also I have with me Dr. Saeed Ahmed, my co-host in this development platform. At the very outset, Camelia, if you could introduce yourself and then you explain what you have written in your publication, in your book. And the book has been published by University of Washington Post, and the South Asia edition is published by the University Press Limited, Dhaka, Bangladesh. So Camelia Dewan, please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much for having me on this talk. It's a great privilege to be here. So I'm an environmental anthropologist working on the anthropology of development or critical development studies in Bangladesh. As Johir Bhai mentioned, I'm currently an assistant professor at the Department of Cultural Anthropology and Ethnology at Uppsala University. And I did all of my UK studies all my studies in the UK. And so my PhD is in anthropology and environment from the University of London, which was an intercollegiate and interdisciplinary collaboration between Birkbeck and the Department of Social Anthropology at SOAS. And before coming to Uppsala, I was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Oslo, where I looked at the socio-environmental effects of shipbreaking in South Asia, or Jahaz Bhanga in Bangladesh.
Okay, thank you very much, Camelia, for this introduction. Actually, I have gone through briefly through your book. I think it covers the issues in the coastal area and how sometimes human interventions cause disasters, triggers disasters. And so basically, if you can give us a brief, what topics have you covered in your book, and what any author, any interested scholars or students can learn from your book?
Thank you. So I first started working in the coastal zone as a research consultant for the International Water Management Institute, and I was the resident representative of IMI in Bangladesh in 2011-12, I think. And we had, so I was in charge of a huge qualitative research survey that looked at water governance and water management challenges in the area, especially shrimp paddy conflicts, but also the operation and maintenance of flood protection embankments. And a major finding from that study was siltation and the salinization of the soil from shrimp farming and how that impacts agrarian or rural livelihoods. And that these water user associations don't work. And so while I was finishing up that research, I really wanted to do a PhD project on, the silting water bodies, all these Mora Kal, Mora Nodi of the coastal zone, siltation. But in 2012-13, there was a lot of money starting to go to climate change. So I asked one of my colleagues how to best pursue a PhD on the topic of siltation and water bodies. And he said, whatever you want to do for your PhD project, add climate change to your funding proposal and you'll get funding. And I did get a lot of funding opportunities actually for this PhD. But it made me wonder to what extent using climate change as a moshul or a spice helps address local needs and concerns of the coastal zone. So I spent 12 months doing ethnographic fieldwork in Bangladesh. So Dhaka with development professionals, but mainly in the southwest coastal zone, both in Shatkhira and Khulna. And in my book, I focus on this one embanked floodplain that I have anonymized and I call Nodi, which is in Khulna district. Um, in my book, I combine environmental history. So I went to the archives of the British Library, looked at old maps and old various colonial documents and so on. And I did that as well as this ethnographic field work that focused on not only rural farmers, but mainly landless women and single mothers. So women doing, these rural roads repair works and so on. And I didn't ask, how does climate change impact your lives? I had a really great translator and colleague and friend who helped me translate to a broader পরিবেশ কিভাবে পরিবর্তন হয়েছে. So what are the changes in the environment you've seen? And by asking this question, people started talking about how embankments have caused waterlogging and siltation. They start talking about, the blue gold era and all these fourth fisheries, various fisheries projects, and introducing tiger prawn and Baghdad hares and gher mahals, and how a lot of the vegetation disappeared with the salinization of soil and also the violence behind it. Asking about how has the environment changed, made people talk about how using Itnashok and Shar pesticides and fertilizers like urea have sucked the earth dry from Shokti, or what soil scientists call soil acidification. So a lot of different complex environmental changes that are rooted in development interventions, whether they be donor-funded embankments, donor-funded fisheries projects, donor-funded green revolution agriculture projects. These have all caused severe environmental effects, but the same interventions are now repackaged as climate adaptation. So that is a fundamental problem that I discuss in my book. And the last,
You find this as a kind of paradoxical situation, right? Yeah.
it's actually kind of logical because these projects want to continue doing what they've always done. And so by saying it's climate change, they can keep on doing that. So I refer to this theoretically as climate reductive translations. So for instance, the policy theory in Bangladesh is Bangladesh will drown in rising sea levels. So if we build higher embankments, that's the climate reductive translations. Or to say Bangladesh will drown in rising sea levels, it will become saline anyways. So why not just shift to brackish tiger prawn cultivation? Or Bangladesh will suffer from climate change and suffer from poor food security. It needs more intensive agriculture. So those are things that I would refer to as climate reductive translations. And one major thing I think is a problem with these climate reductive translations is what doesn't fit into the development story. So my fifth chapter is actually the giving voice to the main livelihood concerns of my interlocutors. And those had nothing to do with climate or salinity or siltation, but that the fact that there is no public healthcare infrastructure in Bangladesh, especially in rural areas. So people get indebted, they use microcredit loans to pay for healthcare for their loved ones, education costs for their children, ghush to get jobs because there's such a huge problem of structural underemployment, and also the problem of child marriage still, and like the domestic abuse. All of these kinds of social problems that are real and violent and difficult, but they don't fit with this climate change victim story.
Yeah. No, that's very important. The points that you have mentioned. Do you have any issues, Said, from your side? Otherwise, I have some points to
No,
follow on.
I think this is a very interesting book, and the topics you have covered are extremely complex, I should say, intricately related with each other. Now, you are analyzing or discussing about all these human interventions, and which are in theory supposed to alleviate the problems, but in reality they have done that, just the opposite. Now this reminds me that water management in this part of the world is nothing new. We have seen this happening during the, say, Mughal era, right? And also there are some farming practices which were in practice for a very long time. For example, floating farming, floating vegetable. Or I don't exactly know how the Mughal era farmers managed their farmlands, and how they let the water pass and let the new silt deposit, and which increased their fertility. So I will be interested to know whether you have focused in these approaches as a solution.
That's great and very insightful. So actually, the first chapter of my book is an environmental history of the Sundarbans, and it has I don't know if I can share. Should have maybe done a PowerPoint. But if you look at the book and the figures of the book, you see this map in chapter 1, I think. Did they not keep the chapter 1? Let me see. I don't know if you can see this map here. It's in the Bangladeshi version, page 30. So this is a map of the 1779 Sundarbans boundary. And then how the boundary went south in 1874. So during the East India Company, how much of the Sundarbans was cleared. So this part of the southwest coastal zone, close to the Pochur Nodi, it was Sundarbans, it was mangroves, it wasn't farmland. But if we look at the environmental history longer, you see how Sufi peers were part of reclaiming the jungle and taming it into farmlands. But what happens when you go down like this is that the farther south you go, you come closer to the Bay of Bengal and salinity intrusion. So even if the Poshur River is a freshwater river, you also have the Shipsha River that comes as a tidal river with salinity. So as they were clearing mangrove forest into farmland, they would build these earthen bunds, Oshtamashi bads, to stop salt water from coming in. Because if the salt water would come in, that farmland, it would revert back into Sundarban mangroves, right? So they did not want salt water. And then during the monsoon, Bosha, all these embankments were broken and enabled the mixing of rainwater, river water, silt to deposit on the land, and it would raise the delta, right? Because the delta is also sinking. And so there was no such thing as flood protection at the time. So they wanted that irrigation water, but after they had harvested the rice in January, then they would close all the mouths of the canals, and this was quite labor intensive. But during the East India Company, it was the zamindar, the person who was getting the money for the yields, that did this. And a huge difference between the Mughal period and the East India Company was during the Mughal period, the Mughal owned everything. No one owned the land. There wasn't zamindaris and landowners. That changed with the 1793 Permanent Settlement Act. So then the British fixed, the East India Company fixed, you are this landowner, you paid this much in revenue to us. But during the Mughal, it was a share of the yield. So Nodi Bhangon, riverbank erosion, all these dynamic flows, maybe a drought year or an extreme event year. It was the share of the yield you gave to the governor of the Mughal empire. But the British, they wanted fixed amounts. So you saw a lot of, Fikar Iqbal writes a beautiful book about this in detail in his book, The Bengal Delta, about how these land tenure practices changed and made zamindars go bankrupt. And you also find it in Amitav Ghosh's Ibis trilogy, I think. So what happened with these fixed permanent settlements is that the deforestation of the Sundarbans just rapidly increased, right? Because they couldn't keep up. The more forest you clear, the less revenue you pay.
Mm.
So the deforestation between 1779 and 1874 is actually quite substantial, and that necessitated the saltwater protection. So the bunds were not there to stop floods; they were there to stop salinity.
Yes. Yes. Mm.
Okay,
Yeah.
no,
Thank you very much, Sam.
that's very intriguing,
Yes.
insightful issue and
Mm.
background actually
Mm.
that you have mentioned. Camelia, as you know, I mean, Bangladesh water management dates back mid 50s or 60s with the ICO master plan. You have heard about it probably. That USAID supported that, and during that time, basically 139 polders in the coastal area were proposed, and initially for at least 20-25 years that gave a lot of actually return in terms of food security. But eventually, because at that time the mathematics on fine silt was not very clear that it will lead to sedimentation. So now development partners are engaged to fix the problem in some way, excavation of the channels, rebuilding the structures, regulators, and so all kinds of retrofitting type of actions. But holders are still there, basically. And in the meantime, coastal embankment improvement projects and similar other projects have been there. So, in view of your study and findings, what is your professional view that the infrastructure that is there that definitely brings benefit if it is maintained properly, and if not, then it is a man-made disaster. So, where to draw the line, and what's your view on that?
That's interesting question, and a very politically sensitive one that I discuss in the second chapter of my book, where I also talk
Mhm.
about blacklisting people that have spoken out against donors with these infrastructure solutions, because it is safe to say, oh, it's the maintenance of the embankments that are the problem, not the embankments themselves. But fundamentally, it is the embankments themselves, because they're based on Dutch polders. And the Rhine Delta, as Dr. Nozrul Islam also has mentioned for decades, it doesn't have that much silt as the Bengal Delta. Like, having Dutch, American, British engineers come and say this is how Bangladesh should do it was fundamentally flawed. But in the historical chapter of my book, I also show British engineers warned against embankments. The people working with water said, this is a delta, the rivers move, there's silt. This is a country for rivers and boats, not for railways and roads. But the financial interests pushed for it. And we see a similar dynamic now where academics, researchers, engineers say, these embankments are really problematic. There's a Vanderbilt study that showed that the unembanked Sundarbans has gained 1.5 meters of elevation, whilst the embanked floodplains from these 139 polders, they're sinking. And then you have the sediment deposits outside. So what are you going to do if you can't talk about the main problem is that after 50 plus 30, 80 years of these polders, where do we go from here? And people have suggested tidal river management. Isla broke a few polders, for instance, and then they saw the silt gaining. But then it becomes a political problem that World Bank and other donors don't want to touch, is how do you compensate people for losing their livelihoods to allow that silt in? That
No,
becomes
that's
very
Yes.
political. And that donors and development professionals and engineers, no one wants to touch that. So it just
Mhm.
is maintenance, but it doesn't solve the issue that all these canals and water bodies are dying. I respect that you are of an older generation, similar to my parents, and I've heard their childhood stories. That
Mhm.
Bangladesh is no more. Like, where are those ponds and canals and rivers with the fish?
Mhm.
Right? Like the
Mhm.
food my mother has told me about, like I don't see that.
Mhm.
Uh, And so I think it is important to talk about siltation and the fact that, in my book, I also talk about decolonizing development, because all of these things during colonial periods, Cold War, Flood
Mm,
Action Plan, and now it's about improving Bangladesh according to a Western standard. For And I think that is the main problem, because the Western standard has completely ruined the entire world and killing us.
mm,
So we need something completely different. And the Dutch, there's an article that came out about Dutch delta expertise and how they're exporting adaptive management to all these deltas in the world. And I think it's important that we resist these universal templates.
mm.
Yeah.
The
That's
Ganges
very
Mm.
and
important.
Rama Delta is very different from the Mekong
Yes.
Delta or the Rhine
Yeah,
Delta.
yeah.
And
Yes.
Bangladesh, why do they need even Dutch expertise? You know a lot, but the problem is, how much can you say honestly in these international contexts? And that is where my Climate Change as a Spice, the second chapter, talks about, how much self-censoring Bangladeshi development professionals do, because they know the funding is coming to climate change. I will speak about climate change. They don't want to hear about the silt.
That's correct.
True.
I agree.
Mm.
And actually, additionally, I can supplement and complement with you, Camelia. In Netherlands, also there is a move, living with the flood kind of move, and then they are removing some of the embankments, and then uh, in fact, the active floodplains are becoming more active in that process, bringing in the benefits of flood. So, in a way, to some extent, I think living with flood, they're moving in that direction,
Mm.
uh, bringing the beneficial aspects of the flood. So, I think it's very eye-opening what you have, uh, in fact, today narrated, Camelia, and very insightful. So finally, if you have anything further to say, to add, you can add. But my last question to you would be, how, on what basis, what triggered to coin this title of the book, Misreading the Bengal Delta? So that's
Oh,
very
that's
intriguing, inspiring title, and it's quite dramatic also, Misreading the Bengal Delta. So yeah, I think we would like to hear a little bit on that before we conclude.
Thank you for that. Yes. So actually, I wanted the book to be called Misreading Climate Change. Um, but I wasn't allowed. But it's inspired actually by a book written by James Fairhead and Melissa Leach called Misreading the African Landscape, where they look at these discourses and of deforestation in Africa, and how they find that policymakers are reading the landscape, the savanna landscape, backwards. They're assuming that deforestation is because of the villagers. But
Mm.
actually, when you look at environmental history and aerial photography, the history is extremely complex. And for me, the misreading is to read all of Bangladesh's current environmental problems as being caused by climate change, because
Okay.
that misses out these development interventions by humans.
Mm. Mm.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I think you have touched upon a very sensitive issue, and which nobody wants to talk about, as we have categorically explained. So
Hmm.
I think it's a must read. I have to get hold of it as soon as possible.
And it's
Yeah,
also
I
free
think.
online.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Online. And I would also want to say that I'd really appreciate like the opportunity, if anyone wants me to zoom in for like a
Mm.
class, if you're teaching my book and so on,
Mm.
please do. And I did write the book for these expats, these international Westerners that come to Bangladesh for the first time, to get like an introduction to Bangladesh. So I do hope that more people read and to try to understand the history of Bangladesh also.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a very good
So,
idea.
so that there we are heading towards the end of this today's development talk, Camelia. But thanks again, our heartiest and sincerest thanks to you for coming to this flat platform and enlightening us on your book and publication and your viewpoints. I think many professionals would be highly benefited by this, and
Yes.
the expats, so-called expats as we call, I think before they come to Bangladesh to work on what sector, I think for them it's a must-read book, and hope that in future, if we invite you, you will again come to give talks on different topics. And wish you all the best and success, Camelia Dewan. So with that, we may conclude today's session, unless you have anything to add.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
It's the book is eye opener for everyone, not just
Yeah.
Westerners.
No, no, no.
The local experts should also
Absolutely,
benefit from
absolutely,
it.
absolutely. No, I mean, yeah, I just on a light note, I said expats,
Yeah.
but it's for all professionals. So
Yes,
thank you
everyone.
so much, Camelia Dewan, and we look forward to meet with you again. And with that, we conclude today's development edition of the Development Talks. Thank you so
Yes.
much.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.